Not long ago, ECOWAS President Julius Maada Bio stood firmly against Burkina Faso's young leader, Ibrahim Traoré. He echoed the calls for Traoré to step down and restore civilian rule. But today, in a stunning twist, Bio stands beside the very man he once opposed. What changed? What forced this shift from pressure to partnership, from rejection to recognition? This is not just politics. This is a story of power, survival, and the shifting future of West Africa. If you want to stay on top of the latest ECOWAS and West Africa updates, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. When Julius Maada Bio assumed the chairmanship of ECOWAS in mid-2023, he stepped into a role heavy with responsibility. West Africa was already reeling from a wave of military takeovers. In just 3 years, democratically elected governments had been swept aside in Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso. For the regional bloc, it was more than a crisis. It was a direct challenge to the credibility of ECOWAS itself. Bio's mission seemed clear: stop the spread of military rule and restore what ECOWAS called constitutional order. But standing in the way was a young soldier who had captured the imagination of millions, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. At just 34, Traoré had seized power from his predecessor, promising to defend his nation against terrorism and foreign exploitation. His rise was lightning fast, and his popularity undeniable. To Julius Maada Bio and to ECOWAS, Traoré represented a dangerous precedent. If one young officer could overthrow a government and win public support, what would stop others across the region from following his example? The bloc needed to act, and act quickly. So ECOWAS turned up the pressure. Deadlines were issued, demands were made. If Traoré refused to set a timeline for elections, Burkina Faso would face suspension, isolation, and even crippling sanctions. In speeches and closed-door meetings, Bio echoed this hard line. To the world, he positioned himself as the defender of democracy in West Africa, the man who would hold the line against military rule. The message was unmistakable. ECOWAS would not tolerate Traoré's government. But what Bio and his allies underestimated was the determination of the young captain and the deep frustration of the people he claimed to represent. The more they pressed, the more he resisted. And soon, the confrontation would explode beyond Burkina Faso's borders. While ECOWAS tightened its grip, Ibrahim Traoré made his position crystal clear. Burkina Faso would not kneel. At just 34 years old, many thought he lacked the experience to stand up to seasoned politicians like Julius Maada Bio. But Traoré understood something his opponents didn't: the will of the people. Every time ECOWAS issued an ultimatum, Traoré went back to his people. He told them that their struggle wasn't just about elections or timelines. It was about survival. Terrorist groups had carved into the heart of Burkina Faso. Villages were abandoned, families displaced. For Traoré, this was not the time for power games. It was the time to defend the nation itself. His defiance wasn't isolated. Very quickly, he found allies in neighboring Mali and Niger, two nations that had also broken away from ECOWAS demands. Together, they created something new: the Alliance of Sahel States, a pact built on military cooperation, political solidarity, and a shared belief that West Africa must chart its own destiny, free from outside dictates. Instead of isolating Traoré, ECOWAS had given him something priceless: legitimacy. He was no longer just a captain who seized power. He was now part of a regional movement, a young leader who stood shoulder to shoulder with other heads of state in defiance of sanctions, threats, and international pressure. The more ECOWAS tried to break him, the more Traoré grew. His speeches became rallying cries, his face a symbol of resistance across the Sahel. For Julius Maada Bio, the message was alarming. The young man he sought to pressure into submission was turning into a powerful figure, one who could reshape the balance of power in the entire region. For decades, ECOWAS had been the political backbone of West Africa, respected, feared, and often decisive. But with the rise of Traoré and the Sahel Alliance, the bloc began to look fragile, even powerless. The sanctions intended to isolate Traoré and his allies backfired. Instead of turning the people against their leaders, they fueled anger at ECOWAS itself. In the markets of Ouagadougou, Bamako and Niamey, citizens didn't blame Traoré or Goïta for shortages. They blamed ECOWAS, and behind it, the West inside ECOWAS, cracks began to appear. Not every member state agreed with the hardline stance. Countries dependent on trade with Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger felt the economic pain of sanctions spilling over their own borders. Others quietly feared that if the bloc pushed too hard, they might push more nations out of ECOWAS entirely. As the Sahel Alliance strengthened, ECOWAS seemed to weaken. Its credibility was questioned, its authority challenged, its unity fractured. Even Bio, once firm in his resolve, could not ignore the growing tide. The more pressure ECOWAS applied, the more resistance it faced. The balance of power was shifting. By early 2024, it was no longer ECOWAS dictating the terms. It was the Sahel Alliance setting the agenda, forcing even Bio himself to reconsider. The bloc that once held the whip hand was now on the defensive, and for Julius Maada Bio, the cost of stubbornness was becoming too high to bear. Do you think ECOWAS made the right move, or is Traoré unstoppable? Comment your thoughts below. We read every comment. For Julius Maada Bio, the reality was impossible to ignore. The very strategy he championed, sanctions, isolation, ultimatums, was failing before his eyes. Burkina Faso was not collapsing. Ibrahim Traoré was not retreating. Instead, he was rising, stronger with each passing month. Bio began to feel the weight of consequences. Sierra Leone, his own nation, depended on trade and regional stability. The economic shockwaves of ECOWAS sanctions were not confined to the Sahel. They rippled across West Africa. Businesses struggled, prices rose, and discontent spread. The punishment designed for Traoré was now punishing Bio's own people. And then came the political reality. Traoré was not standing alone. With Goïta in Mali and Tiani in Niger, the Sahel Alliance was speaking with one voice, and millions were listening. Their defiance had transformed into legitimacy, not just at home, but across borders. Even in countries still within ECOWAS, young people began to echo their calls for sovereignty. Bio was caught between two forces, the old guard of ECOWAS urging him to stand firm, and the new wave of Pan-African resistance proving impossible to silence. Each day, it became clearer. Continuing down the path of confrontation meant risking ECOWAS itself, and his own reputation as a pragmatic leader. And so, Julius Maada Bio began to pivot. Not in grand declarations at first, but in subtle shifts of tone. His words softened. His condemnations grew quieter. A man once at the front of ECOWAS's hardline stance was beginning to turn. The Bio of 2023, fierce and unyielding, was giving way to a different leader. One who saw the writing on the wall. By mid-2024, Julius Maada Bio's transformation was undeniable. The same man who once demanded Traoré's immediate withdrawal from power was now speaking of dialogue, understanding, and the unique challenges of the Sahel. The hardline stance had melted into a pragmatic pivot. For some within ECOWAS, this was betrayal. They accused Bio of weakness, of abandoning the principles of constitutional rule. But Bio knew what they refused to admit. Legitimacy had shifted. The sanctions had failed, and the people's loyalty was not with ECOWAS, but with leaders like Traoré. And so, Bio made his move. At a closed-door meeting, he argued not for harsher measures, but for engagement. He urged fellow leaders to rethink strategy, to meet the Sahel Alliance not with ultimatums, but with negotiation. In public, he began to recognize the security struggles these nations faced, lending credibility to the very leaders he once opposed. The handshake between Bio and Traoré was more than symbolic. It was a signal to the entire region that the balance of power had shifted. ECOWAS was no longer dictating terms to the Sahel. Instead, it was adjusting to their reality. For Traoré, it was vindication. For Bio, it was survival. And so, in the eyes of history, Julius Maada Bio moved from Traoré's fiercest critic to a reluctant ally. A pivot that shocked some, relieved others, but above all revealed one truth. The old order was giving way to the new, and Bio had chosen not to fight the tide, but to move with it. Julius Maada Bio's change of stance is more than a political adjustment. It is the story of an entire region redefining itself. Yesterday, ECOWAS stood as the unchallenged voice of West Africa. Today, the Sahel Alliance speaks with growing authority, and leaders like Ibrahim Traoré have become symbols of defiance and sovereignty. Bio's pivot from opposition to cautious support tells us one thing: the tide has shifted. The balance of power no longer rests in boardrooms and sanctions, but in the streets, the battlefields, and the voices of the people. The question that remains is simple: will this new unity lead to lasting independence, or to deeper divisions? One thing is certain: West Africa will never be the same again. If you want to stay on top of the latest ECOWAS and West Africa updates, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next.